The Victorian Novel. During the Victorian age, for the first time there was a communion of interests and opinions between writers and their readers. One reason for this close relationship was the enormous growth of the middle classes. Although its members belonged to many different levels, while literacy had penetrated in a heterogeneous way, they were avid consumers of literature. They borrowed books from circulating libraries and read the abundant variety of periodicals. Moreover, Victorian writers themselves often belonged to the middle class. A great deal of Victorian literature was first published in a serial form. Essays, verse, and even novels made their first appearance in installments in the pages of periodicals. This allowed the writer to feel he was in constant contact with his public. He was obliged to maintain the interest of his story gripping because one boring installment would cause the public not to buy the periodical any longer. There was a further advantage because an author could always alter the story according to its success or failure. Reviewers also had a strong influence on the reception of literary works and on the shaping of public opinion. The Victorians showed a marked interest in prose, and greatest literary achievement of the age is to be found in the novel, which soon became the most popular form of literature and a main source of entertainment. The spread of scientific knowledge made the novel realistic and analytical. The spread of democracy made it social and humanitarian, while a spirit of moral unrest made it inquisitive and critical. During the 18th century, novels generally dealt with the adventures either of a social outcast or a more virtuous hero, but their episodic structure remained the same. The idea of thematic unity was brought in by Jane Austen, with the theme of a girl's choice of a husband, and by the Gothic writers. Was that the novels in a remote, at times strange and exotic past. In the 1840s, novelists felt they had a moral and social responsibility to fulfill. They wanted to reflect the social changes that have been in progress for a long time, such as the Industrial Revolution, the struggle for democracy, and the growth of towns and cities. The novelists of the first part of the Victorian period described society as they saw it, and with the exception of those sentiments which offended current morals, particularly regarding the sex, nothing escaped their scrutiny. They were aware of the evils of their society, such as the terrible conditions of manual workers and the exploitation of children. However, their criticism was much less radical than that of contemporary European writers like Balzac, Flaubert, Turgenev, and Dostoevsky, because the historical condition of Britain were quite different from those of France or Russia. Didacticism was one of the main features of Victorian novels because novelists also conceived literature as a vehicle to correct the vices and weaknesses of the age. The voice of the omniscient narrator provided a comment on the plot and directed a rigid barrier between right and wrong behaviors, light and darkness. Retribution and punishment were to be found in the final chapter of the novel, where the whole texture of events, adventures, and incidents had to be explained and justified. The setting chosen by most Victorian novelists was the city, which was the main symbol of the industrial civilization, as well as the expression of anonymous lives and lost identities. In their effort to portray the individual motives for human action, and all that binds man and woman to the community, Victorian writers concentrated on the creation of realistic characters the public could easily identify with. In terms of comedy, especially Dickens' characters bore dramatic passion. For example, the Bronte sisters' coverings. Types novels. We can find among the Victorian novel the novel of manners, the humanitarian novel, and the novel of formation, Bildungsroman. So the novel of manners, it kept close to the original 19th century's model. It dealt with economic and social problems and described a particular class or situation. A master of this genre was William Thackeray. The humanitarian novel, Charles Dickens' novels are the mostly admired for their tone, with combining humor with a sentimental recast. For reform for the last fortnight, they constitute the bulk of what is generally called the humanitarian novel, or the novel of purpose, which could be divided into novels of realistic, fantastic, or moral nature, according to the predominant tone or issue dealt with. The novel of formation, the Bildungsroman, novel of formation or education, became very popular after the publication of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre and Dickens' David Copperfield. These novels dealt with one character's development from early youth to some sort of maturity. The works behind the Bronte sisters can be linked to the persistence of the Romantic and Gothic traditions. They focus on intense subjective experiences rather than on a world of social interaction. Literary nonsense. A particular aspect of Victorian literature is what is called nonsense, created by Edward Lear and Lewis Carroll. In his famous novel Alice, Adventures in Wonderland, Carroll created a nonsensical universe where the social rules and conventions are disintegrated. The cause-effect relationship does not exist anymore, and time and space have lost their function or given an order to human experience. It is important to underline that a great number of novels published during the mid-Victorian period, up to 1870-80, were written by women such as Bronte sisters and George Eliot, the pen name of Mary Ann Evans. This output is surprising considering the state of subjection of Victorian women. It is less surprising if one remembers that the majority of novels buyers and readers were women. Middle-class women had more time to spend at home than men and could devote part of the day reading. However, it was not easy to get published, and some women used a male pseudonym in order to see their work in print. Creative writing, like art and other public activities, was considered masculine. From Jane Austen to George Eliot, the woman's novel had moved in the direction of a realistic aspiration of the daily lives and values of women within the family and the community. The late Victorian novel. The late Victorian novel mirrored a society linked to a growing crisis in the moral averages fields. Taoist evolution theory influenced the structure and the organization of the realistic novel. We started to follow an evolutionist pattern. Coincidence were fully exploited to solve the intricacies of the plot, and chance played a Darwinian role. The best representatives of the realistic novel were Thomas Hardy and George Eliot. While Eliot focused on the psychological and moral complexity of human beings, Hardy presented the strong individuals, the manifestation of the strong forces of nature to whom he opposed the strong social forces of history and human civilization. Hardy's protagonists are also defined by their native regions, and at the same time painfully alienated by them. The psychological novel. Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde tried to capture the most physiological aspects of life and described the double nature of Victorian society. Stevenson seems to be concerned not only with the duality present in every individual but also in Victorian society as a whole, where aristocracy was only superficially kind and resigned, but hid dark secrets in their beautiful houses. Most of the action in the novel takes place at night, and much of it in the poor district of London, considered the place of evil doers. Most significantly, Mr. Hyde enters and leaves Dr. Jackie's house through the back door, which seems a metaphor for the evil that lies behind beautiful facade of civilization and refinement. The name Jekyll and Hyde have become synonymous with multiple personality disorder. The return period marked the highest point of British imperialism. The most obvious influence of colonialism on Victorian literature can be found in the works of Rudyard Kipling. His novels and short stories are set in the distant lands colonized by Britain. It is in the reality of colonialism which makes up the background where an adventurous narrative is made possible. Kipling exalted British imperial powers as a sacred duty in the poem The White Man's Burden. Here, he legitimized the belief that it was the task of the white man, and in particular of the British, to carry civilization and progress to the savage. Aestheticism and decadence. The birth of the aesthetic movement. The aesthetic movement developed in the universities and intellectual circles in the last decades of the 19th century. It began in France with Gautier, Théophile Gautier, a reflected sense of frustration and uncertainty of the artist, his reaction against materialism and the restrictive moral code of the bourgeois, and his need to redefine the role of art. As a result, French artists withdrew from the political and social scene and escaped into aesthetic isolation, into what Gautier defined art for art's sake. The Bohemian embodies his protests against the monotony and vulgarity of bourgeois life, leading an unconventional existence, pursuing sensation and excess, and cultivating art and beauty. So this doctrine, the aesthetic doctrine, was imported into England by James McNeill Whistler, an American painter who worked in England. However, the roots of English aesthetic movement can be traced back to the Romantic poet Don Keats, as well as to Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Rossetti was a remarkable example of an artist dedicated wholly to his art. John Ruskin, too, in his search for beauty in life and art, even while insisting upon moral values, paved the way for the works of Walter Pater, who is regarded as the main theorist of the aesthetic movement in England. Walter Pater's studies in the history of the Renaissance and his masterpiece Marius the Epicurean were immediately successful, especially with the young, because of their subversive and potentially demoralizing message. He rejected the reader's faith and said that the art was the only means to halt the passage of time, the only certainty. His out life should believe in the spirit of art, namely as a work of art, filling each passing moment with intense experience, and feeling all kinds of sensations. The task of the artist was to feel sensations, to be attentive to the attractive, the courteous and the cheerful. So the artist was seen as the transcriber not of the world, not of mere fact, but of his sense of it. The main implication of his new aesthetic position was that art had no reference to life, and therefore it had nothing to do with morality and did not need to be didactic. Pater's work had a deep influence on the poets and writers of the 1890s, especially Oscar Wilde, as well as the group of artists that met in the Rhymers Club and contributed to the Yellow Book. This periodical, published from 1894 to 1897, reflected decadent taste in its sensational subjects. The term decadent generally implied a process of decline in recognized values. By the end of the century, it was used as an aesthetic term across Europe. A number of features can be distinguished in the work of aesthetic artists: excessive attention to the self, a hedonistic and sensuous attitude, perversity in subject matter, disenchantment with contemporary society, and evocative use of language. Decadence must be seen as a European movement. In the late 1880s, a group of French writers contributed to the journal Le Décadent. They were the symbolists Rimbaud, Verlaine, and others. Jodescal Huysmans wrote a Rimbaud's novel whose hero, the Santis, tries to create an entirely artificial life in his search for unusual sensation. This character became the models for wise dandy. The main representatives of decadence in Italy were the Belli d'Annunzio with his Novo del Piacere, and the poets Giovanni Pascoli and Guido Buzzano. The poetry of Rainer Maria Rilke was one of the most remarkable expressions of the decadent sensibility in the German language. But let's see, the dandy, so the figure of the dandy, the Tom Dandy, probably derives from the Scottish nickname for Andrew, was first used in the song Yankee Doodle Dandy, sung by the British troops during the American Revolution. The walls of the song mock the colorful uniform of the American soldiers. The imaginary character Yankee Doodle, standing for the American flag, was depicted riding a pony with a feather on his hat. So the Tom Dandy referred to a man who boasts about his appearance even though he was wearing ordinary clothes. Vanity, extravagance, and refinement were linked to the more positive idea of the dandy, which developed thanks to the figure of George Bryan Brummer. George Bryan Brummer became the leader of early 19th century fashion for the exquisiteness of his dress and manners, and for 20 years had the Prince Regent, later George I, the Fourth, as a friend and admirer. A quarrel and gambling debts forced him to flee to France, where he eventually died in an asylum for the poor. Brummer created dandyism as a lifestyle. From England, this trend spread to France, where it was connected to artistic movements such as symbolism and aestheticism. Reinforced by the French influence, dandyism appeared in England towards the end of the 19th century with the figure of Oscar Wilde. Victorian drama. There is often said to be a gap in the history of the English theatre between 18th century and late 19th century. In fact, apart from William Congreve, no great author had written plays of any worth after the Elizabethan times. Several factors can explain the situation. First of all, the rise of the novel. The power of theatrical managers who decide what plays might appeal to the audience and give financial returns. The presence of great actors and actresses whose virtuosity often turned very poor plays into great success, and the fact that rich middle classes did not appreciate drama as a form of art, and actors were still considered as men of little respectability. However, new theatres were built in London and in other cities during the Victorian age. These playhouses were smaller than the ones built in the previous century. In the second half of the Victorian era, various improvements made the theatres more comfortable, and the new methods of light in the stage were capable of producing more realistic effects. Actors were thus given the opportunity of developing a subtle style of performance. The stage direction of Victorian plays were much longer and more detailed. They sought various purposes, such as illustrating aspects of the characters' personalities, describing in detail direction or gestures, and conveying the art's comments. The developments in stage techniques meant that theatre's production were far more complicated and instruction were needed. When the electric lighting was introduced in theatres, it greatly affected how performances were staged. In fact, since then, actors have performed in bright light in front of an audience eaten in darkness. Thus the viewer's experience has become individual rather than communal. Going to the theatre became as important as the play people were going to see. The theatre architecture, the audience attire and stage mirrored Victorian society. Types of theatrical performances which flourished in the Victorian era were music hall, pantomime, farce and melodrama with a sensational and romantic plot. The ingredients were often the same: virtuous heroines in danger, hard-hearted, conspiring villains, and happy endings with the triumph of the true love and punishment of the villain. Oscar Wilde and George Bernard Shaw were by far the most outstanding playwrights of the end of 19th century and of the Victorian drama. Wilde wrote brilliant comedies whose main feature was dialogue full of humour and wit, intended to expose the faults and hypocrisy of his age. George Bernard Shaw considered grammar as a vehicle for presenting his views on social institution and human experience in provocative form. He was influenced by the great Norwegian playwright Erik Ibsen, who addressed the social and the domestic problems of the time. Ibsen's work had a tremendous impact on English theatre. Ibsen opened up new dramatic possibilities and his examples encouraged writers to concern themselves with social and personal problems, regardless of strict Victorian censorship.